200 million years ago, the rain on Earth began to change. At first, it didn't seem dangerous. Clouds gathered, water fell, rivers filled, but something about the sky was no longer quite right. The air was growing warmer, the oceans were releasing gases, and the clouds were holding more than just water. Over time, the rain became heavier, more frequent, more acidic. Soils that had once supported forests began to weaken. Plants were not dying from drought, they were being slowly washed away. Rivers swelled and shifted. Lowlands flooded again and again, and the land struggled to recover between storms. This was not a single disaster. For hundreds of thousands of years, and perhaps longer, Earth remained locked in a wet, overheated state, where the climate could no longer reset itself. Each round of rain made the planet a little warmer. Each warm spell fed the clouds, and each cloud returned the water again. A loop had begun. Some forms of life faded quietly, others adapted to the soaked, unstable world. Evolution continued, but under skies that no longer behaved the way they once had. But what could have turned rain into a force of collapse? And how did anything survive beneath a sky that would not recover? Tonight, we drift gently into that strange atmosphere to listen to what the storms of deep time still whisper. But before we begin, if this quiet journey is bringing you a little comfort, you're always welcome to leave a like or join us here by subscribing. And if you'd be so kind, let me know in the comments, where are you winding down from tonight and what time is it there? I love seeing how far across the world these stories travel. Now take a slow breath, let your shoulders soften, and together let's drift gently into the time when the skies turned against Earth. Long before the skies grew heavy and the rains lingered too long, Earth moved with a quiet sense of restraint. Heat arrived each day from the sun, settled briefly across land and sea, then slowly found its way back into space. This exchange was not hurried. It unfolded through countless small movements, guided by water, air, stone, and living things, all working together without intention, yet with remarkable consistency. The oceans carried much of this responsibility. Their vast surfaces absorbed warmth during long days and released it gently during long nights, smoothing extremes that would otherwise fracture the climate. Currents traveled across basins like slow breaths, transporting heat from equatorial waters toward cooler latitudes and returning cold depths toward the light. Even when continents shifted and coastlines redrew themselves, the oceans continued this steady circulation, acting as memory keepers of warmth, never allowing the planet to forget balance entirely. Above them, clouds drifted as quiet mediators between sky and surface. They reflected portions of sunlight back into space, shielding the planet from excess heat, while also trapping enough warmth to keep temperatures from collapsing after sunset. Their shifting shapes were not random chaos, but part of a responsive system, forming and dissolving as moisture rose and fell. Rain emerged from this cycle, not as an assault, but as a gentle correction. It cooled overheated air, fed rivers and soils, and returned water to places that had grown dry. In its ordinary rhythm, rainfall helped reset the atmosphere again and again. Across the land, vegetation completed the circuit. Forests and wetlands softened the sun's influence by shading soil and releasing moisture back into the air. Leaves breathed water upward, encouraging cloud formation without overwhelming it. Roots anchored the ground, slowing runoff and allowing rain to soak inward rather than rush away. Through this exchange, plants moderated both heat and water, preventing sudden swings from taking hold. Even sparse plant cover could shape climate locally, altering winds, humidity, and temperature in subtle ways that accumulated over time. Together, oceans, clouds, and life formed a network of checks and responses. When heat increased, evaporation rose, clouds followed, and reflection strengthened. When cooling set in, clouds thinned, sunlight returned, and warmth rebuilt itself. Carbon moved through this system slowly, cycling between air, water, rock, and organisms, rarely lingering long enough in one place to cause imbalance. Over long stretches of time, this gentle feedback kept Earth within familiar boundaries, even as continents drifted and species changed. This balance did not mean stillness. Ice advanced and retreated, forests expanded and withdrew, seas rose and fell. Yet beneath these shifts ran a deeper stability, a planetary habit of correction. Change unfolded gradually, allowing ecosystems to adjust, migrate, and adapt without being pushed beyond their limits. The climate behaved like a patient tide rather than a breaking wave. For most of Earth's history, rain belonged to this stabilizing rhythm. It cooled, nourished, and connected distant regions through rivers and clouds. It carried minerals from stone to soil and energy from sky to sea, stitching the planet together through motion rather than force. The system endured because no single part dominated for long. Balance emerged not from control, but from cooperation between countless moving pieces, each responding to the others in quiet, predictable ways. It was this long standing equilibrium that made the later disruptions so profound. When the familiar exchanges began to slip out of alignment, the planet did not recognize itself immediately. The mechanisms were still present, oceans still moving, clouds still forming, rain still falling. Yet the delicate timing that once guided them had begun to drift, and the slow certainty Earth relied upon was no longer guaranteed. As Earth settled into its long patterns of balance, another presence moved quietly through the background, rarely noticed, yet deeply influential. Carbon dioxide drifted through the air in small, steady amounts, invisible and unremarkable, mingling with winds and clouds. It was not an intruder, it had always been part of the atmosphere, rising from oceans, soil, and living breath, then returning again through stone, water, and growth. In moderation, this gas served as a thin blanket around the planet. Sunlight arrived freely, warming land and sea, while some of that warmth lingered instead of vanishing immediately into space. Nights cooled gently rather than sharply, seasons transitioned rather than snapped. This soft retention of heat allowed liquid water to remain stable across vast regions and life to unfold without constant thermal shock. The atmosphere breathed and carbon moved within it like a patient pulse. The subtlety of this process made it easy to overlook how sensitive it was. Each additional trace of carbon dioxide slightly thickened that invisible blanket. Heat lingered a little longer after sunset. Oceans held warmth closer to their surfaces. Air currents adjusted their paths in response, almost imperceptibly at first. Nothing dramatic announced these changes. They accumulated quietly, like dust settling layer by layer in an undisturbed room. As temperatures edged upward, the planet responded through familiar routes. Warmer oceans released more moisture into the air. Evaporation quickened, clouds gathered more readily, and rainfall increased. At the same time, warmer water also released dissolved gases, including additional carbon, back into the atmosphere. What had once been a slow exchange began to gain momentum, each movement reinforcing the next with gentle persistence. This was where small changes began to matter. Slight warming encouraged more carbon to linger in the air. More carbon allowed more heat to remain. Additional heat altered circulation patterns, shifting where clouds formed and how long they stayed. Rainfall redistributed itself, falling more often in some regions and retreating from others. None of these steps alone disrupted the planet, yet together they nudged the climate into unfamiliar territory. The feedbacks grew gradually stronger. As soils warmed, organic material broke down more rapidly, releasing carbon that had once been stored safely underground. Forests under prolonged stress struggled to maintain their role as carbon sinks. Some ecosystems released more than they absorbed, tipping local balances in subtle ways that spread outward through air and water. The atmosphere became a busier place, holding on to what it once passed along without pause. Even so, the changes unfolded without sharp boundaries. There was no single moment when balance broke. Instead, the system drifted, guided by incremental adjustments that favored warmth and retention over release. Carbon did not flood the sky all at once. It accumulated through patience rather than force, rising in concentration the way a tide rises, unnoticed until it has already reshaped the shore. As the atmosphere grew slightly thicker with heat-trapping gases, familiar safeguards lost some of their strength. Clouds still formed, rain still fell, oceans still circulated, yet their responses no longer fully countered the warming they encountered. Each cycle returned the planet to a warmer resting point than before. Equilibrium shifted quietly, step by careful step. Through it all, life persisted within the narrowing margins. Organisms adapted to warmer nights and heavier air. Metabolisms adjusted, migrations shifted, and growth patterns changed. Carbon's slow accumulation did not end life's story, but it rewrote its conditions. The planet remained alive, active, and responsive, though the balance it once relied upon was becoming harder to recover with each passing breath of warm air. Deep beneath shifting continents and quiet ocean floors, Earth carried another mechanism of balance, slower than winds and rain, yet far more enduring. Carbon that drifted into the air did not remain there forever. Over immense spans of time, rainwater absorbed portions of it, forming gentle acids that slipped into soil and stone. Rivers carried that dissolved carbon toward the sea, where it settled into sediments, becoming part of shells, reefs, and mineral layers that slowly thickened on the ocean floor. As plates moved, these carbon-rich layers did not stay buried forever. They traveled on descending slabs of crust, sinking toward warmer depths where pressure and heat altered them again. At those boundaries, stone softened, water escaped, and carbon found its way back into molten rock. This descent and return unfolded so slowly that it barely registered against the pace of weather or life. Yet it formed a planetary rhythm, carrying carbon away from the sky and storing it safely within the earth, sometimes for tens of millions of years. Volcanoes marked the return path. When magma rose and reached the surface, it did more than build mountains and islands. It released stored gases, including carbon dioxide, back into the atmosphere in measured amounts. Most eruptions were modest, sending thin veils of gas into the air that blended quietly with global circulation. Over long intervals, this steady release replaced what had been lost to stone, keeping the atmosphere supplied without overwhelming it. The planet exhaled gently, not in bursts, but in a near constant whisper. This exchange acted as a stabilizer, precisely because of its slowness. When climates cooled and carbon levels dropped, volcanic release gradually restored warmth. When climates warmed, weathering and burial worked more efficiently, drawing carbon back down. The system did not aim for perfection, only resilience. It resisted sudden extremes by stretching change across deep time, allowing oceans, clouds, and ecosystems to adjust without being pushed too far too quickly. Volcanism itself was not chaos. Beneath the surface, pressure accumulated gradually as plates drifted, collided, or pulled apart. Magma collected in chambers, cooled, reheated, and moved again, often without ever reaching open air. Even eruptions followed patterns shaped by tectonics and chemistry. They were not interruptions of balance, but part of it, releasing energy and material that the planet had been storing patiently. For long ages, this internal valve remained well matched to the atmosphere above. The carbon released through eruptions roughly balanced the carbon being locked away, and the climate hovered within familiar ranges. Life adapted to these rhythms, growing and diversifying under skies that changed slowly enough to be navigated. Yet this balance relied on timing more than strength. The system could absorb release if it came gently, stretched across long durations. Its weakness lay not in the presence of volcanoes, but in their potential to fall out of step. When internal conditions altered the pace of release, the steady whisper risked becoming something heavier. The valve itself did not fail, but its tempo mattered deeply. Earth's long patience depended on that rhythm remaining slow, allowing its surface systems to respond before warmth and carbon began to accumulate faster than they could be set aside again. For most of Earth's history, volcanic activity unfolded as a scattered and restrained presence. Individual mountains built themselves slowly, releasing magma in brief episodes separated by long, quiet intervals. Lava cooled, gas dispersed, and the land adjusted. These eruptions left marks on the landscape, yet they rarely altered the planet's broader rhythms. They were local expressions of a much deeper system, releasing pressure in small, manageable breaths. At rare moments, however, the character of volcanism shifted. The molten rock beneath the crust did not rise through a single narrow throat, but spread outward through widening fractures. Instead of building towering cones, lava poured across the land in vast sheets, following gravity rather than explosion. These outpourings did not announce themselves with towering ash clouds or violent blasts. They arrived with persistence, covering plains again and again, layer upon layer, until entire regions transformed into stone. In these episodes, the scale alone set them apart. Rivers of lava stretched across distances comparable to modern countries, flowing quietly but relentlessly. Forests disappeared beneath advancing fronts, soils vanished, and lowlands filled until their original shapes were erased. Each individual flow cooled and hardened, yet beneath it, pressure continued to build. New magma followed old paths, spreading across freshly formed rock, thickening the surface in slow, patient increments. What made these eruptions truly different was not just their size, but their endurance. Instead of lasting days or years, they unfolded across spans measured in hundreds of thousands of years. One eruption faded as another began, separated by pauses too brief for full recovery. The land barely had time to weather, erode, or regrow before it was covered again. The process felt continuous when viewed from afar, a long chapter of heat rather than a series of isolated events. As magma reached the surface again and again, gases escaped steadily into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide rose not in sharp spikes, but through accumulation. Each release added to the last, building slowly within the air above. Because the pace was extended rather than abrupt, Earth's usual buffering system struggled to keep up. Weathering worked as it always had. Oceans absorbed what they could, and life continued its exchanges with the air. Yet the inflow exceeded what could be set aside in time. These long eruptions were often tied to deeper movements within the planet. Tectonic plates shifted, stretched, or weakened, allowing magma to rise easily through broad zones rather than confined channels. The crust thinned, fractures multiplied, and heat found many exits at once. Instead of a single volcano acting alone, entire regions became pathways for molten rock, turning the surface itself into a slow-moving vent. The atmosphere responded gradually but decisively. As lava continued to emerge, gases continued to escape, and warmth lingered more stubbornly with each passing cycle. Unlike brief volcanic winters caused by ash, these events favored sustained warming. Their influence accumulated through patience rather than force, reshaping climate not by interruption, but by persistence. Life endured beneath these conditions, adjusting in quiet ways. Some habitats vanished, while others expanded into newly formed landscapes. Rivers carved fresh channels through cooling basalt, and plants recolonized fractured stone when intervals allowed. The world did not end, but it changed its footing. When eruptions stopped being small, they stopped being easily absorbed, and the planet carried their influence forward long after the last flows cooled into silence. Beneath continents that appeared solid and unmoving, slow forces gathered quietly. Heat from deeper layers pushed upward, and the crust above responded not with sudden violence, but with gradual strain. Stone stretched millimeter by millimeter, thinning as it was pulled apart. The surface showed little sign at first. Valleys widened subtly, faults lengthened, and the ground adjusted with patient creaks rather than sharp breaks. As tension increased, cracks formed not as gaping chasms, but as networks of weakness. These fractures allowed pressure from below to ease upward. Magma that had once been trapped deep within the mantle found new routes toward the surface. Instead of collecting beneath a single volcano, it spread laterally, pooling beneath broad regions where the crust had grown thin and porous. Heat lingered closer to the surface, warming rock that had long been cooled. In these stretched zones, magma behaved differently. The pathways upward were wide and forgiving, lacking the narrow conduits that usually build pressure. Gas escaped gradually through countless small openings rather than being trapped in confined chambers. Without compression, eruptions lost their explosive character. Lava emerged calmly, oozing rather than blasting, spilling outward across the land with a steady patience that matched the pace of the forces driving it. The surface responded by sinking as much as it rose. As magma drained upward, the crust above sagged, forming broad basins that deepened over time. These lowlands became natural channels for molten rock, guiding flows outward and allowing them to spread widely before cooling. Each layer added weight, pressing the crust further down, encouraging new fractures to open nearby. The process reinforced itself through repetition rather than force. Unlike sudden eruptions that scar a landscape briefly, this style of volcanism reshaped entire regions gradually. Lava advanced in sheets, following the contours of land, filling depressions, and smoothing irregular terrain. Cooling crust cracked again under renewed heat, reopening pathways that had barely sealed. The ground never fully rested. It shifted, settled, and fractured in slow motion, barely perceptible within a single lifetime, yet transformative across geological time. The absence of explosive eruptions also meant the atmosphere experienced a different kind of influence. Ash did not darken the sky in short, violent pulses. Instead, gases escaped steadily from countless openings, blending into the air above with little spectacle. Carbon dioxide and other volcanic gases accumulated through continuity rather than shock, changing the character of the atmosphere without the dramatic interruptions that usually draw attention to volcanic activity. As continents continued to stretch, magma supply remained constant. Deep sources fed shallow reservoirs, and shallow reservoirs fed the surface without pause. The planet's surface became an extension of its interior, exchanging material freely where barriers had thinned. This openness sustained lava floods across immense spans of time, far longer than any single volcano could endure alone. Life above adapted to this shifting ground as best it could. Some regions became landscapes of fresh stone, warm and unstable, where only the hardiest organisms took hold. Elsewhere, intervals between flows allowed soil to form briefly before being covered again. Rivers adjusted their courses around new ridges and basins, carving paths through cooling rock as if testing its strength. The cracking of the crust did not arrive with drama. It unfolded through patience, driven by forces that valued persistence over speed. When magma flooded upward instead of erupting explosively, it signaled a deeper shift within the planet, one where Earth released its internal energy across wide surfaces and long ages, altering both land and sky through calm, relentless motion. As the crust continued to thin and fracture, a broader movement began to reveal itself. Tectonic plates that had once pressed firmly together started to drift apart, slowly and without urgency. This separation did not occur along a single clean line. It unfolded across wide regions, stretching the surface like fabric pulled from both ends. The land responded by lengthening, sinking, and opening pathways that had never existed before. Far to the west, this quiet divergence marked the early beginnings of a vast basin. What would one day become the Pacific was not yet an ocean, but a widening scar where Earth's surface gave way to deeper forces below. As plates separated, molten material rose to fill the space they left behind. New crust formed continuously along these spreading zones, still warm, buoyant, and unstable, carrying heat upward as it expanded. This growth at the margins required adjustment elsewhere. As new crust emerged in one region, older crust was pulled outward, stretched beyond its comfortable limits. Ancient North America felt this strain not as collision, but as tension. The continent did not shatter suddenly. Instead, it elongated gradually, thinning across broad interiors far from the growing basin. The ground flexed and settled, responding to distant movement with local consequence. Within this stretched crust, heat traveled upward more easily. Magma that once pooled deep below found shallower resting places, lingering closer to the surface. Faults multiplied quietly, forming long valleys and subtle depressions that reshaped drainage patterns. Rivers adjusted their paths, following newly formed lows, carrying sediment across landscapes that were slowly being pulled apart beneath them. This stretching acted like an open invitation to the mantle. Without thick rock to contain it, molten material rose persistently, feeding lava flows that spread widely across the continent's western margins. Each arrival added weight and warmth, further weakening the crust below. The surface sank under its own accumulation, deepening basins that funneled more magma upward in return. The relationship between plate movement and surface volcanism tightened with each passing cycle. As the Pacific Basin widened incrementally, its influence extended far beyond its forming edges. The redistribution of crust altered stress patterns across continents, shifting where heat escaped and where stone fractured. North America became a participant in this distant process, its interior responding to the ocean that was trying to be born thousands of kilometers away. The continent stretched in sympathy, its stability compromised not by impact, but by absence. The atmosphere above remained largely unaware of the slow rearrangement below, yet its future was being shaped by these motions. Extended volcanism, associated with plate separation, released gases steadily into the air. Without dramatic eruptions to draw attention, the release blended into the background, persistent and cumulative. Heat lingered near the surface, warming land and sea gradually, altering circulation patterns that followed the shifting geography. Across the continent, ecosystems adapted to landscapes that refused to remain still. Plains subsided, uplifts formed gently, and coastlines changed their outlines without notice. Forests advanced and retreated as drainage patterns evolved, and wetlands formed in newly created basins. Life responded to these changes as it always had, through movement, adjustment, and quiet persistence. The birth of an ocean was not an event, but a long negotiation between stone and heat. As plates pulled apart and continents stretched, the planet rearranged itself piece by piece. Ancient North America carried the marks of this process within its thinning crust and broad lava plains, shaped by a distant widening basin that would one day hold the largest ocean on Earth. Across the stretched margins of the continent, the surface changed character entirely. Instead of isolated vents or towering cones, the land opened itself in long, shallow scars. From these broad fissures, lava emerged not in bursts, but in steady advance. It flowed outward in glowing sheets, spreading quietly across plains and valleys, following the lowest paths with unhurried determination. There was little sound beyond a distant crackle as heat met air, and little ash to dim the sky. The ground simply became fluid and began to move. These were the eruptions later known as Reangelia, though at the time they had no name, only presence. Lava poured across the landscape in volumes difficult to comprehend from the surface. Individual flows stretched for hundreds of kilometers, merging with neighboring streams until boundaries disappeared. What began as separate rivers of molten rock joined into continuous fields, wide enough to swallow forests, wetlands, and entire drainage systems without pause. The lava moved slowly but relentlessly, advancing meter by meter, day after day. Its surface cooled and darkened as it traveled, forming a fragile crust that cracked open repeatedly to release fresh heat beneath. This gave the impression of solid ground until the crust shattered again and molten stone surged forward, reclaiming its shape. Nothing dramatic marked its arrival. There was only the quiet replacement of one surface with another. As flow followed flow, the land rose under the accumulating weight. Layer after layer hardened into basalt, compressing what lay beneath and smoothing the terrain above. Hills softened into plateaus, and valleys filled until they vanished entirely. Rivers diverted around new obstacles or disappeared beneath advancing stone, re-emerging far downstream where fractures allowed water to escape again. The geography rewritten by lava was simpler, broader, and more uniform than what it replaced. The scale of these outpourings defied comparison to ordinary eruptions. Each major phase covered areas comparable to modern states, sometimes larger, transforming regional landscapes into continuous expanses of dark rock. From horizon to horizon, the ground bore the same texture and color, broken only by cracks where heat still escaped. What had once been a mosaic of ecosystems became a vast, slowly cooling surface, warm long after the lava itself had stopped moving. Time was the defining feature of these eruptions. They did not end after seasons or lifetimes. Instead, they persisted across spans measured in hundreds of thousands of years. One episode eased as another began nearby, keeping the land in a near constant state of renewal. Even as vegetation attempted to reclaim cooled surfaces, new flows arrived to cover them again. Soil struggled to form before being buried, and recovery unfolded in fragments rather than continuity. Throughout this long interval, gases escaped alongside the lava. Carbon dioxide and other volatiles seeped steadily into the atmosphere, not violently released, but added patiently, year after year. The sky absorbed these additions quietly, and their effects accumulated slowly, woven into the broader rhythm of climate rather than interrupting it. The absence of explosive force made the change easy to overlook, yet its persistence ensured it would not remain subtle. Life adapted where it could. Heat-tolerant plants colonized cooling basalt, anchoring themselves in cracks where dust gathered. Insects followed, then small animals, always one step behind the retreating warmth. Yet each return of lava reset the process, keeping large regions in a state of perpetual beginning. Lava, without end, reshaped the continent through endurance rather than spectacle. Its influence lay not in single moments, but in the length of time it remained present, quietly altering land, air, and the conditions under which life continued to unfold. As the lava continued its quiet advance across the land, the sky above received a steady companion it could not see. With every new surface formed, gases long stored within the mantle escaped into the open air. Carbon dioxide rose without urgency, blending seamlessly into the atmosphere, invisible yet persistent. There were no singular moments of release to mark its arrival. The increase unfolded gradually, each addition layering upon the last, building a presence that lingered far longer than any cloud. Over the full span of the Reangelia eruptions, the volume of carbon released reached an extraordinary scale. Measured across hundreds of thousands of years, the total output rivaled and exceeded what modern industry has produced across its entire existence. Human emissions, vast though they are within a brief moment of time, represent only a fraction of this ancient release. Here, the difference lay not just in quantity, but in duration. Carbon flowed continuously from the ground, year after year, without meaningful pause. The atmosphere accepted these additions quietly at first. Winds carried the gas around the globe, dispersing it evenly, while oceans absorbed what they could at their surfaces. Plants drew in carbon as they always had, weaving it into new growth wherever conditions allowed. These familiar pathways remained active, working steadily to restore balance as they had for ages. Yet the rate of release slowly outpaced these responses. Carbon entered the sky faster than rain and rock could return it to the earth. Oceans warmed as they absorbed heat, reducing their capacity to hold dissolved gases. As surface waters grew lighter and more buoyant, deeper layers mixed less freely, limiting how much carbon could be carried downward and stored safely away. What once sank now lingered near the surface, closer to the air above. Weathering across the land continued its patient work, but it too faced limits. Fresh rock, exposed by lava flows, had not yet broken down into soil capable of binding carbon efficiently. Much of the surface remained raw stone, offering little opportunity for long-term storage. Rain washed across these new landscapes quickly, carrying minerals to the sea without the deep interaction needed to lock carbon away. The cycle continued, but its effectiveness diminished under the sheer volume passing through it. As carbon accumulated, the atmosphere thickened gently, holding warmth closer to the planet. Nights released less heat into space, and days added more than before. This subtle retention altered evaporation rates, encouraging moisture to rise more readily from warming seas. Clouds formed with ease, and rainfall increased in frequency, feeding a system already strained by excess energy. The planet was not unresponsive. Each increase in warmth activated stabilizing forces that had worked for eons. Yet these forces required time, and time was the one resource not being granted. The supply from below continued, patient and unbroken, while the mechanisms above struggled to adapt quickly enough. Balance slipped not through collapse, but through persistence. Life remained woven into this exchange, absorbing carbon where it could and releasing it in turn. Ecosystems shifted as conditions changed, sometimes expanding, sometimes retreating but never halting the flow. The carbon flooding the sky did not arrive as a sudden catastrophe. It gathered quietly, filling the atmosphere until Earth's familiar rhythms were stretched beyond their comfort, carrying the weight of a release too vast and too sustained to be absorbed all at once. The atmosphere carried the accumulated carbon quietly, yet its presence began to reshape how energy moved across the planet. Sunlight still reached the surface as it always had, warming oceans and land through familiar paths. The difference now appeared after that warmth arrived. Heat lingered. Instead of drifting back into space during the long calm of night, a portion remained, held gently but persistently by the thickening air. The planet began to retain more than it released. This change did not announce itself with sudden heat. It unfolded through subtle shifts in average conditions. Nights cooled less deeply. Seasonal contrasts softened. Warm periods lasted longer, overlapping rather than ending cleanly. The land adjusted slowly, but the oceans felt the change most clearly. Their vast surfaces absorbed extra warmth day after day, storing it beneath rolling waves and quiet currents. Water that had once cooled easily now held onto heat, carrying it forward through time. As surface temperatures rose, the character of the oceans shifted. Warmer water expanded, becoming lighter and more buoyant, reducing the easy mixing between surface and depth. Heat concentrated near the top, creating broad layers of warmth that stretched across basins. This warmth altered how gases moved between sea and sky. Carbon that once dissolved readily now escaped more easily, reinforcing the conditions that had warmed the oceans in the first place. With warmth held close to the surface, evaporation began to change. The sun required less effort to lift water into the air. Moisture rose steadily from oceans, lakes, and wetlands, invisible at first, then gathering as humidity thickened. The air grew heavier with water vapor, itself a powerful holder of heat. Each breath of warm, moist air added to the planet's ability to retain energy, strengthening the cycle already underway. Clouds responded to this new abundance. They formed more readily and persisted longer, spreading across the sky in broader patterns. Some reflected sunlight away, but many acted as insulating layers, slowing the escape of heat during night. Rainfall increased not in isolated bursts, but in frequency, feeding the surface with repeated returns of the same warmed water. Each cycle carried heat upward, then delivered it back again. The greenhouse effect deepened through accumulation rather than excess. No single day felt radically different from the last. Instead, the baseline shifted. Oceans warmed a little more each season. Air held moisture more easily. Evaporation followed warmth, and warmth followed evaporation, linking sky and sea in a continuous exchange of energy. As water vapor increased, storms gained depth rather than speed. They lingered, drawing strength from warm surfaces and releasing it slowly as rain. The process fed itself quietly. Warm oceans fueled evaporation. Evaporation built clouds. Clouds trapped heat. Trapped heat returned to the oceans. The system no longer reset itself fully between cycles. Life moved within this changing atmosphere without immediate rupture. Marine organisms adjusted to warmer waters. Coastal environments shifted their boundaries. On land, growing seasons lengthened in some regions, while others faced soil saturation that limited recovery between rains. The changes arrived gently enough that adaptation seemed possible, yet persistent enough to reshape the conditions under which adaptation occurred. The greenhouse had begun not as a wall of heat, but as a gradual enclosure. Each retained measure of warmth narrowed the margin through which the planet could cool. Oceans, once Earth's greatest stabilizers, now carried more energy than before, passing it back to the air through evaporation and rain. The cycle turned smoothly, quietly, and without pause, guiding the planet into a warmer, wetter state that unfolded one breath of air at a time. As oceans continued to warm, their surfaces no longer rested quietly beneath the sky. Heat stored within the upper layers of water rose steadily into the air, lifting moisture with ease. Evaporation became constant rather than episodic, turning the sea into a continuous source of rising vapor. The boundary between ocean and atmosphere blurred, linked by a steady upward flow that never fully paused. This moisture did not drift aimlessly. Warm air expanded as it rose, cooling just enough to allow water droplets to form. Clouds assembled with remarkable efficiency, spreading wider and lasting longer than before. Each cloud carried more water than its predecessors, fed by seas that replenished moisture as quickly as it could be removed. The sky grew busy, layered, and increasingly occupied. Storm systems began to organize themselves around this abundance. Instead of forming, releasing rain, and dispersing, they lingered. Warm oceans sustained them from below, replacing lost energy almost immediately. As rain fell, more vapor rose to take its place, reinforcing the structure overhead. What had once been a temporary gathering of clouds became a self-maintaining process, fueled by the same warmth it helped circulate. Air currents adapted to this new arrangement. Rising columns of moist air strengthened circulation patterns that drew in more heat and water from surrounding regions. Storms expanded outward, pulling energy across wide areas and redistributing it through persistent rainfall. The atmosphere behaved less like a passive layer and more like an engine, converting ocean heat into motion and rain with growing efficiency. Rainfall followed this change in character. It no longer arrived as brief relief between dry spells. It returned repeatedly, often before the land had time to recover from the last descent. Soils remained saturated, streams ran full, and lowlands stayed submerged longer with each passing season. The ground absorbed what it could, then yielded, allowing water to pool, flow, and return again with the next cycle. Because storms lingered, their paths overlapped. Regions that once experienced varied conditions settled into near constant precipitation. Clouds regenerated as quickly as they emptied, guided by the same warm surfaces that had summoned them initially. Even when rainfall eased briefly, humidity kept the air heavy, ready to rebuild the system at the slightest encouragement. The machine-like nature of these clouds lay in their feedback. Warm oceans produced vapor. Vapor formed clouds. Clouds trapped heat. Trapped heat warmed oceans further. Each step reinforced the next, smoothing irregularities rather than allowing them to reset. The system grew stable in its motion, even as it became unstable for the landscapes beneath it. Rivers adjusted reluctantly, channels widened, banks softened, and floodplains expanded. Sediment moved more freely, carried by waters that rarely fell back to gentle flow. Vegetation struggled to re-establish roots before the next saturation event, and recovery became uneven. Some areas adapted to near-permanent wetness, while others lost their resilience entirely. Above it all, the sky rarely cleared fully. Sunlight filtered through layers of cloud, warming surfaces indirectly and reducing nighttime cooling. Even when storms weakened, cloud cover persisted, maintaining the conditions needed for the next cycle to begin. The atmosphere no longer waited for triggers. It operated continuously, driven by stored heat and abundant moisture. Clouds had become more than weather. They functioned as a system that converted warmth into endless motion, cycling water from sea to sky to land and back again without rest. Rainfall became relentless not through intensity alone, but through endurance. The planet found itself beneath a sky that worked steadily, tirelessly, turning warmth into water again and again, shaping a world where dryness grew rare and recovery required far more time than the climate was willing to offer. As the atmosphere grew heavier with volcanic gases, rain began to arrive carrying more than water alone. Invisible compounds released from the ground blended with rising vapor, dissolving quietly into forming clouds. Sulfur and carbon mixed into droplets as they gathered, altering their nature before they ever touched the surface. From above, the rain still looked familiar, falling in soft curtains across land and sea, yet its chemistry had begun to shift. When these clouds released their moisture, the water carried a sharper edge. Each drop held, dissolved acids formed high in the sky, created through gentle reactions between gas, sunlight, and air. The change was subtle at first, undetectable without time or accumulation. Streams still flowed, leaves still glistened, and the ground darkened under repeated rainfall. Only gradually did the consequences emerge, unfolding through repeated contact rather than immediate destruction. Soil felt the impact before forests did. Acids seeped downward through layers that had once buffered rain with ease. Minerals essential for plant growth leached away more quickly than they could be replaced, carried off into rivers and eventually the sea. The structure of the soil weakened, losing its ability to hold water and nutrients together. What remained became thinner, less resilient, and increasingly vulnerable to erosion. Forests rooted in these soils struggled quietly. Leaves exposed to altered rain lost their protective balance, experiencing stress that did not kill instantly, but reduced growth over long stretches of time. Trees that had thrived in stable conditions produced weaker wood and fewer seeds. Canopies thinned, allowing more sunlight to reach the forest floor, which in turn warmed and dried upper soil, layers between storms, accelerating nutrient loss when the next rains returned. Repeated rainfall prevented recovery. Each storm washed the ground again before roots could extend deeper or microbial life could rebuild what had been stripped away. Fungi and bacteria that once supported plant health found their chemical environment shifting beyond familiar bounds. The unseen networks beneath the surface weakened, breaking connections that forests depended upon to share resources and maintain stability. Rivers carried the evidence of this slow damage. Their waters grew richer in dissolved minerals pulled from the land, their clarity altered by increased sediment. Floodplains expanded as banks softened, and channels wandered more freely across terrain that no longer held firm. Wetlands changed character, receiving water that arrived warmer and more acidic than before, reshaping the communities that lived within them. Despite the gentleness of each individual rainfall, the cumulative effect reshaped ecosystems. Forests did not collapse all at once. Instead, gaps appeared where trees failed to regenerate. Open spaces widened, favoring species better suited to disturbance and constant moisture. Older plant communities retreated gradually, replaced by forms more tolerant of unstable soils and altered chemistry. Life adapted unevenly. Some plants found opportunity in reduced competition, spreading across newly exposed ground. Others faded without obvious drama, their decline marked only by absence where abundance once stood. Insects and animals followed these changes, responding to altered food sources and shifting habitats, adjusting their movements across landscapes that no longer offered the same support. Rain remained frequent, persistent, and unavoidable. It continued to fall with the same steady rhythm established earlier, yet its relationship with the land had changed. What once nourished now tested resilience. The damage did not come from intensity, but from repetition. With each cycle, the ground lost a little more strength, and forests thinned quietly beneath a sky that delivered water endlessly, no longer gentle in what it carried with it. Before the sky changed its habits, the land had been shaped by forests unlike those familiar today. Across broad plains and gentle uplands stood communities of ancient plants, adapted to warmth without excess and rain that arrived, then withdrew. Tree-sized ferns unfurled layered canopies, seed ferns spread wide fronds over damp ground, and early conifers rose with narrow crowns designed for steady light rather than constant saturation. These forests moved with the seasons, breathing in moisture during wet periods and enduring quieter intervals of drying that allowed roots and soil to recover. Beneath their leaves, the ground held structure and memory, layers of organic matter built slowly, binding minerals and microbes into a living fabric. Roots spread laterally through stable soil, anchoring trees and sharing resources through vast underground networks. Rivers traced predictable paths nearby, flooding occasionally but retreating in time for seedlings to establish themselves. The system favored patience, and in that patience, these forests endured for long stretches of deep time. The new climate unsettled that balance gradually but relentlessly. Heat lingered where it once eased away, and rainfall returned before evaporation and drainage could complete their work. Soils remained waterlogged, losing oxygen essential for root health. Microbial communities shifted, breaking down organic material faster than it could be replenished. Nutrients washed away repeatedly, leaving less behind with each cycle. Plants adapted to earlier conditions found themselves mismatched to the new rhythm. Shallow root systems suffocated in saturated ground, while deeper roots struggled as soil structure weakened and collapsed. Leaves designed to shed occasional rain remained wet for long periods, encouraging decay and reducing their efficiency. Growth slowed, reproduction faltered, and forests that once renewed themselves steadily began to thin from within. Competition intensified under these conditions. Faster growing plants seized open spaces created by dying trees, but even they faced unstable footing. Storms returned too frequently for young growth to mature fully, and repeated flooding uprooted saplings before they could anchor themselves. Recovery became fragmented. Small clearings expanded into larger gaps, and once continuous canopies broke apart into isolated stands. Over time, the composition of forests shifted towards species better suited to persistent moisture and warmth. Some conifers adjusted by narrowing their leaves further, reducing water retention. Certain fern groups spread across open ground, tolerant of saturated soils and frequent disturbance. Yet diversity declined as specialization narrowed. The complex layering that once characterized these forests simplified into fewer dominant forms. This transformation did not unfold as a sudden die-off. It appeared as a gradual absence. Tree rings thinned, seedlings failed more often than they succeeded, fallen trunks decayed without replacement. What remained stood farther apart, casting weaker shade over ground that warmed and eroded between rains. Insects and animals tied to these forests followed the change, adapting where possible, retreating where not. As forests receded, their influence on climate weakened further. With fewer roots to hold soil, erosion accelerated, sending sediment into rivers already swollen by constant rain. Reduced canopy cover allowed more heat to reach the surface, reinforcing evaporation and cloud formation above. The loss of forests became both result and reinforcement of the new conditions, deepening the cycle that had begun in the sky. Ancient forests did not vanish entirely, but their dominance faded. Landscapes once shaped by stable, enduring plant communities shifted toward mosaics of resilience and loss. The collapse was quiet, measured in generations rather than moments, leaving behind a world where the old forests survived only in fragments, memories written into stone and soil beneath a climate that no longer moved to their familiar pace. As ancient forests thinned and retreated, the change rippled outward into the living networks that had depended on them. Food chains built slowly over countless generations found their foundations weakening. Insects that relied on specific leaves, spores, and stems lost the precise resources they were adapted to use. Their life cycles, timed to seasonal growth and predictable shelter, drifted out of alignment as plants failed to return in familiar patterns. Many insects were specialists, shaped by long association with particular forest plants. Some fed only on tender fronds that once unfurled reliably each season. Others required stable leaf litter to shelter their eggs and larvae. As repeated rains stripped soil and altered plant chemistry, these microhabitats disappeared. Populations thinned quietly, not through dramatic die-offs, but through missed generations and shrinking ranges. Herbivores followed the same pattern at a larger scale. Early reptiles and amphibians that grazed on low vegetation or browsed on young growth found less to sustain them. Plants that survived produced fewer leaves, tougher tissues, or chemical defenses shaped by stress rather than abundance. Feeding became less efficient, requiring more energy for less return. Juveniles struggled to grow quickly enough in landscapes that no longer offered consistent nourishment. As herbivore numbers declined, predators felt the absence almost immediately. Carnivores adapted to specific prey, faced longer searches and wider territories. Hunting strategies honed for dense forests faltered in increasingly open, unstable terrain. Energy budgets tightened, reproduction slowed. Some predators shifted diets where possible, but many lacked the flexibility to adapt quickly to new conditions. The collapse did not move evenly through the system. Some insects persisted longer in wet refuges, and certain herbivores followed plant remnants into sheltered valleys or newly forming wetlands. These pockets of survival created fragmented food webs, isolated from one another by expanses of degraded land. Movement between them became risky, and genetic diversity narrowed as populations lost contact. As old food chains unraveled, simpler ones briefly emerged in their place. Opportunistic species spread into newly opened niches, feeding on decaying matter or fast-growing plants that tolerated disturbance. These communities were less complex and less stable, rising quickly but lacking the depth that once allowed ecosystems to buffer change. Predators in these systems were fewer and smaller, adapted to short cycles rather than enduring abundance. Water played a quiet but decisive role in this transformation. Saturated ground limited burrowing insects, frequent flooding disrupted nesting sites. Rivers that wandered unpredictably carried nutrients away from feeding grounds, concentrating life in narrow bands along their edges. Each adjustment reduced the space where long-established interactions could continue uninterrupted. The disappearance of old food chains left echoes across the landscape. Bones and shells accumulated where populations failed to renew themselves. Tracks vanished from paths once worn smooth by repeated passage. Sounds changed as well, with fewer movements stirring the understory and less activity marking the night. The world grew simpler in motion, even as it remained full of life. This simplification was not empty, but transitional. Ecosystems shed complexity that could no longer be supported under constant rain and warmth. Relationships forged under earlier climates loosened and fell away, making room for new arrangements better suited to the altered rhythm. The loss of old food chains marked a turning point, not as an ending, but as a quiet clearing of ecological memory, preparing the ground for forms of life that could move faster, adapt sooner, and endure a world that no longer paused long enough for the old connections to hold. As environments shifted faster than living systems could follow, the planet entered a period of biological strain that unfolded quietly rather than violently. Extinction did not arrive as a single wave, nor did it announce itself through sudden emptiness. It appeared as hesitation within life's rhythms. Populations stopped expanding, recovery slowed. Species that had survived previous fluctuations found themselves pressed by changes that no longer arrived one at a time. Climate chaos disrupted the subtle agreements life depends upon. Temperature, moisture, chemistry, and seasonality began to drift out of sync with one another. Rain arrived too often, warmth lingered too long, and soils changed faster than roots could adjust. Organisms evolved to tolerate a range of conditions, yet they relied on predictability more than perfection. When patterns refused to settle, even moderate conditions became difficult to endure. Extinction in such moments unfolded through attrition. A missed breeding season reduced numbers slightly. A flooded habitat prevented juveniles from maturing. A shift in plant chemistry altered food quality just enough to weaken growth. None of these pressures acted alone, yet together they narrowed the margin between survival and decline. Over generations, the losses accumulated, thinning populations until continuity could no longer be maintained. Some species vanished locally long before they disappeared entirely. Their ranges fragmented into isolated pockets, separated by environments they could no longer cross. Genetic diversity declined as populations shrank, reducing resilience even further. What had once been adaptable became brittle, not from weakness, but from isolation. The landscape itself became a barrier, reshaped by climate into something unfamiliar. Other organisms persisted longer by chance rather than strength. Generalists, capable of feeding broadly or reproducing quickly, filled gaps left by more specialized forms. These survivors altered ecosystems simply by remaining, changing interactions and flows of energy. The loss of one species reshaped the pressures on others, sending ripples through food webs already under strain. Stability mattered more than any single measure of heat or rain. Life could endure warmth if it arrived slowly. It could endure moisture if it receded predictably. What it struggled with was constant adjustment. When conditions shifted repeatedly before adaptation could take hold, evolution had no steady ground to work upon. Selection favored speed and flexibility, but even these traits required a baseline from which to operate. The planet itself did not recognize loss in real time. Oceans continued to circulate, clouds continued to form, and land continued to erode and rebuild. From this perspective, extinction blended into the background, yet the biosphere felt the change intimately. Ecosystems simplified, interactions shortened. The intricate layering built over millions of years loosened as components dropped away. This period of biological shock was not uniform across the globe. Some regions buffered change better than others, offering refuges where conditions shifted more gently. Life clustered into these spaces, intensifying competition while leaving other areas sparsely inhabited. The uneven distribution of survival reshaped migration patterns and set new boundaries for expansion. Despite the losses, life did not collapse entirely. It persisted within narrower corridors of possibility, waiting for conditions to slow their pace of change. The chaos acted not as an ending, but as a filter, allowing only those forms able to tolerate instability to remain active participants in the evolving world. Biological shock marked a moment when Earth's living systems lagged behind its physical momentum. Stability, more than temperature, proved to be the quiet architect of survival. Where it vanished, extinction followed not through catastrophe, but through the steady wearing away of relationships that once allowed life to renew itself with confidence. Animals moved through this altered world beneath skies that rarely rested. Storms returned before the land fully dried, and humidity lingered even when rain briefly eased. Survival depended less on strength or size and more on the ability to respond quickly to conditions that refused to settle. Life adjusted its pace, favoring motion over permanence, flexibility over specialization. Large animals faced the greatest challenge. Their size demanded stable food sources and predictable landscapes. Under constant storms, those certainties faded. Flooded ground made long migrations difficult. Saturated soils weakened the footing needed to support heavy bodies. Plants that once fed large herbivores recovered too slowly between rains, offering less nutrition with each passing cycle. Growth slowed, reproduction faltered, and populations declined quietly through missed opportunities rather than sudden loss. Smaller animals moved differently through this environment. They required less food, matured faster, and adapted more easily to fragmented habitats. When storms reshaped the land, they could relocate quickly, exploiting temporary shelters formed by fallen trees, eroded banks, or newly created wetlands. Shorter life cycles allowed them to respond across generations rather than lifetimes, tracking change instead of resisting it. Shelter became transient. Burrows collapsed in waterlogged soil, and nests built in familiar locations washed away. Animals that relied on flexibility rather than fixed homes found an advantage. Those capable of climbing, swimming, or hiding within dense vegetation navigated the shifting terrain with greater success. Mobility mattered more than territory, and speed mattered more than endurance. Feeding strategies also shifted. Predators that depended on ambush in dense forests struggled as canopies thinned and cover disappeared. Smaller hunters adapted by pursuing prey in open or semi-flooded landscapes, using agility rather than concealment. Scavenging increased where storms disrupted food chains, and animals capable of opportunistic diets persisted where specialists declined. Reproduction followed the rhythm of instability. Species that produced many offspring increased the chance that some would survive sudden flooding or habitat loss. Rapid maturation shortened the gap between generations, allowing populations to recover quickly from setbacks. Egg laying in protected microhabitats, such as sheltered ground or vegetation above floodlines, improved survival even when conditions shifted unexpectedly. Water itself became both obstacle and resource. Constant rain expanded wetlands and temporary waterways, favoring animals comfortable in mixed environments. Amphibious lifestyles, whether through behavior or body plan, allowed access to food sources unavailable to strictly terrestrial competitors. Movement between land and water offered refuge during storms and access to dispersed prey afterward. Heat compounded these challenges. Warm, humid air increased metabolic demands, making efficient cooling essential. Smaller bodies shed heat more easily and required less energy to maintain temperature balance. Active periods shifted toward brief windows when conditions allowed, and animals able to rest in shaded or moist refuges conserved energy more effectively. Over time, the animal community simplified. Fewer large forms remained, replaced by a diversity of smaller species occupying narrow niches. Interactions became shorter and less complex, shaped by immediate conditions rather than long established patterns. The constant storms favored life that could move, reproduce, and adapt quickly, even if that life remained fragile and temporary. Life under constant storms did not vanish. It rearranged itself around speed, resilience, and flexibility. The advantage belonged to those that treated the landscape as something to navigate rather than possess. In a world that no longer paused long enough for stability to return, survival belonged to those who could keep moving as the rain continued to fall. As the climate settled into warmth and near constant moisture, the land began to change its expression once more. Where ancient forests had thinned and fallen away, rain continued its steady work, soaking ground that rarely dried completely. In these conditions, new plant communities found opportunity. Water no longer arrived as a seasonal visitor. It became a defining presence, pooling in lowlands, feeding rivers, and saturating soils across wide regions. These rains encouraged rapid growth. Plants that thrived in warmth and moisture spread quickly, covering open ground before erosion could remove it. Leaves broadened to capture filtered light beneath cloud-heavy skies. Vines and early climbers reached upward along any available support, weaving loose canopies over ground that had only recently been bare stone or degraded soil. The land softened under this return of green, reshaped by roots that stabilized surfaces loosened by earlier loss. The forests that emerged differed from those that came before. They were denser in some places, yet less orderly, built for speed rather than permanence. Growth favored continuous expansion, with plants competing vertically and horizontally for space. Wetlands blended seamlessly into forest margins, and rivers threaded through vegetation that pressed close to their banks. The world took on a more tropical character, not defined by latitude, but by humidity and warmth that rarely relented. Conifers found renewed success within this environment. Their structure offered resilience where other forms struggled. Narrow leaves shed water efficiently, reducing damage from constant rainfall. Strong wood resisted saturation and collapse, allowing trunks to rise even in unstable soil. Some conifers adapted to warmer conditions by expanding into regions once unsuitable, taking advantage of open niches left behind by earlier forest collapse. Alongside them, new plant groups spread quietly. Seed-bearing plants diversified, experimenting with different reproductive strategies better suited to unpredictable conditions. Faster life cycles allowed them to take advantage of brief openings created by floods or landslides. Seeds traveled easily by water, carried downstream to fresh ground where rain ensured immediate growth. This mobility allowed plants to track shifting landscapes with greater ease than those tied to slow regeneration. These emerging forests changed how energy moved across the land. Dense vegetation trapped moisture near the surface, reinforcing humidity and encouraging further rainfall. Transpiration from countless leaves fed clouds above, tightening the connection between forest and sky. Shade moderated ground temperatures, protecting soil life that rebuilt slowly beneath the canopy. The land regained a measure of stability, though one shaped by constant growth rather than seasonal balance. Animals responded to this greening world. Smaller species found shelter within thick vegetation, while insects returned in abundance, drawn by new leaves and decaying plant matter. Food webs reassembled around these forests, though simpler than before, aligned with rapid turnover rather than long-lived equilibrium. The landscape felt alive again, moving with growth rather than erosion. The rise of new forests did not restore what had been lost, but it reshaped possibility. These were ecosystems adapted to instability, built to tolerate frequent rain, warmth, and shifting ground. Their presence marked a transition, not a recovery to earlier conditions, but a step into something different. Rain that once eroded now nourished, warmth that once strained now sustained. In this persistent humidity, Earth found a new way forward. The forests that spread across the land were not echoes of the past, but responses to the present. They held the ground, fed the sky, and prepared the surface for further change, quietly transforming the planet beneath clouds that continued to drift, gather, and return water to a world learning how to live under endless rain. Water settled into the low places and stayed. With rain returning again and again, landscapes that once drained quickly began to hold moisture for long stretches of time. Valleys softened into marshes, floodplains widened, and shallow basins filled until their edges blurred. Rivers slowed as their banks spread outward, no longer confined to narrow channels, but free to wander across broad, saturated ground. These new wetlands acted as quiet architects of change. Sediment carried by constant flow settled gently rather than being swept away, building layers of rich ground over seasons measured in patience. Organic matter accumulated where water slowed decomposition, creating dark soils that retained warmth and nutrients. The land became spongy and alive, capable of absorbing rain rather than shedding it immediately. Rivers adjusted to this transformed terrain. Their courses shifted more easily, carving new paths through softened ground. Channels split and rejoined, forming braided networks that changed shape gradually with each cycle of rain. During floods, water spilled outward without force, feeding wetlands that stored moisture long after surface flow receded. Even when rain paused briefly, the land remained wet, releasing water slowly back into the system. This constant exchange reshaped local climates. Evaporation from wetlands cooled the air just above the surface, while dense vegetation trapped humidity close to the ground. Morning mists lingered longer, and temperature extremes softened within these saturated zones. The land and air interacted continuously, forming small-scale climates nested within the broader warmth of the planet. New habitats emerged within this mosaic. Shallow waters supported aquatic plants that rooted themselves in nutrient-rich mud. Emergent vegetation formed dense margins along river edges, offering shelter and food for insects and small animals. Pools connected during floods and separated during drier intervals, creating a patchwork of conditions that favored diversity over dominance. Life found opportunity in these shifting boundaries. Species capable of moving between water and land flourished, exploiting resources unavailable to strictly terrestrial or fully aquatic forms. Invertebrates multiplied in abundance, feeding on decaying plant matter and supporting higher layers of the food web. Fish and amphibian-like creatures followed expanding waterways, finding refuge in wetlands that buffered them from harsher conditions elsewhere. The persistence of these environments encouraged experimentation within life's designs. Limbs adapted for wading and swimming, skin and scales adjusted to constant moisture. Reproductive strategies shifted toward using water as both shelter and transport. Eggs and young developed in protected shallows where temperature and chemistry remained relatively stable compared to the open land. Vegetation reinforced these changes. Plants rooted in wetlands slowed water further, encouraging sediment to settle and soils to deepen. Roots stabilized banks, while fallen stems created natural barriers that reshaped flow. Each growth cycle strengthened the habitat, making wetlands more resilient even as surrounding landscapes continued to adjust. These ecosystems did not replace forests entirely. Instead, they threaded through them, creating gradients rather than borders. Dry ground transitioned gradually into damp soil, then into standing water, allowing species to move across environments without abrupt change. This continuity fostered resilience, offering multiple pathways for survival within a climate that still demanded flexibility. New ecosystems formed not through sudden creation, but through persistence. Water lingered long enough for life to adapt, then remained longer still, allowing complexity to grow. Wetlands and rivers reshaped the land by slowing it down, softening extremes, and opening space for new forms of life to take hold. In a world defined by constant rain, these environments became quiet centers of stability, nurturing diversity within motion and preparing the ground for the next unfolding chapter of Earth's living story. As older ecosystems thinned and simplified, absence itself became a powerful force. Predators that once ruled stable forests and intricate food webs found fewer pathways to survive. Their size, specialization, and dependence on predictable prey turned into liabilities when landscapes refused to settle. One by one, these dominant forms faded, leaving behind spaces where pressure once existed and now did not. The land grew quieter in its upper tiers, marked not by sudden silence, but by the gradual easing of control. With the loss of established predators, balance shifted downward through the system. Smaller animals moved with less constraint, exploring territories that had once been tightly regulated by pursuit and competition. Prey species expanded their ranges tentatively at first, then, with greater confidence, as generations passed without familiar threats. The rhythm of life loosened, creating space for experimentation rather than repetition. Empty niches appeared wherever interactions had broken apart. These niches were not physical places alone, but roles within the living network. Feeding strategies went unused. Hunting methods fell dormant. Behavioral patterns shaped by long competition no longer dominated the landscape. Energy flowed differently through ecosystems, lingering at levels where it once passed quickly upward. In these open roles, evolution found opportunity. Variation that might once have been suppressed now persisted long enough to matter. Traits suited to speed, flexibility, and rapid reproduction gained importance. Smaller bodies required fewer resources and recovered more quickly from disturbance. Shorter generations allowed advantageous changes to spread before conditions shifted again. Life adapted not toward dominance, but toward responsiveness. Young lineages began to diversify quietly. Some explored new diets made possible by changing vegetation. Others tested new modes of movement across wetlands, open ground, and forest edges. Without entrenched predators to limit their expansion, these forms spread into roles that had been inaccessible before. Competition returned gradually, but it was lighter, less absolute, allowing multiple experiments to coexist. The disappearance of old hunters also altered behavior. Animals that once relied on concealment in dense forests adapted to more open terrain, refining agility and awareness instead of camouflage alone. Senses sharpened, social behaviors shifted. Cooperation and group movement offered advantages where solitary strength once prevailed. The absence of familiar dangers reshaped how life related to itself as much as how it related to the land. Plants played a role as well. New vegetation patterns supported different feeding strategies, favoring grazers and browsers able to move frequently rather than rely on fixed territories. This mobility reduced the advantage of ambush predators built for stable environments. As prey diversified, so too did the foundations for future predators, though these would emerge shaped by speed and efficiency rather than size and force. Evolution worked patiently within this opening. It did not rush to replace what was lost. Instead, It explored what was possible under new rules. Failed experiments vanished quietly. Successful ones spread, not because they were perfect, but because they fit the moment. The process favored those able to endure change, not those optimized for a single condition. Over time, the landscape filled again with interaction, but of a different kind. The emptiness left by old predators was no longer empty. It had been transformed into a field of potential where new creatures could arise without immediate suppression. This period did not erase the past. It built upon its absence, using loss as raw material for renewal. The opportunity for new creatures emerged not from catastrophe alone, but from release. When long-standing pressures lifted, life responded by diversifying into the space left behind. Evolution followed the quiet invitation offered by empty niches, shaping forms that would carry the story forward under skies and landscapes forever changed. Small dinosaurs emerged quietly into the spaces left behind, not as rulers, but as participants well suited to a changed world. They were not the towering figures of later ages. Instead, they were light, narrow-bodied, and often no taller than the vegetation they moved through. Their frames favored motion over mass, with long legs built for steady travel across uneven ground and flexible tails that helped maintain balance as landscapes shifted beneath frequent rain. These early dinosaurs carried traits shaped by instability rather than dominance. Many were bipedal, lifting their bodies above saturated ground and moving efficiently through wetlands and forest edges alike. Elevated posture reduced contact with waterlogged soil, limiting heat buildup and exposure to persistent dampness. Their stride allowed them to cross open stretches quickly, relocating as storms reshaped habitats without relying on fixed territories. Heat tolerance played a quiet role in their success. Smaller bodies released excess warmth more easily than larger ones, a valuable advantage in humid air that resisted cooling. Their metabolism favored constant, moderate activity rather than bursts of power followed by long rest. This steady pace suited environments where shelter was temporary and foraging required frequent movement between scattered resources. Skin and coverings adapted as well. Early feather-like structures likely aided temperature regulation, allowing air to circulate close to the body and moisture to shed more effectively after rain. These coverings also offered insulation during cooler intervals, supporting activity across a wider range of conditions without large swings in energy demand. Comfort within variability became a survival advantage. Diet flexibility further supported their spread. Many early dinosaurs were opportunistic feeders, consuming small animals, insects, and plant matter as availability shifted. This broad intake reduced dependence on any single food source that storms or flooding might disrupt. Rapid digestion and frequent feeding matched landscapes where abundance appeared in pulses rather than steady supply. Reproductive strategies aligned with this pace of life. Faster maturation allowed populations to grow and recover quickly, even when local conditions deteriorated. Eggs laid in protected or elevated sites increased survival in wet ground, while shorter generations allowed beneficial traits to spread efficiently. Adaptation unfolded across decades rather than centuries, keeping pace with the environment. Movement linked these traits together. Small dinosaurs could follow river corridors, skirt wetlands, and cross open ground without exhausting reserves. When forests thickened, they slipped between trunks and undergrowth. When vegetation thinned, they traversed exposed plains with equal ease. Their range expanded not through conquest, but through compatibility with diverse habitats shaped by heat and rain. As they spread, These dinosaurs did not displace all others immediately. They coexisted alongside remaining reptiles and amphibians, sharing space through subtle differences in behavior and timing. Activity during warmer or drier intervals, reduced competition, and mobility allowed retreat when conditions worsened. Their presence grew gradually, becoming more common without demanding attention. Over generations, this quiet persistence reshaped the animal community. Small dinosaurs filled roles once fragmented by ecological disruption, connecting food webs across land and water. They became reliable components of the landscape, present wherever warmth and moisture dominated. Their success did not depend on size or strength, but on resilience tuned to a world that remained in motion. The spread of small dinosaurs marked a gentle turning point. Without fanfare, they demonstrated how life could flourish within heat and humidity, not by resisting change, but by moving with it. Their rise reflected an alignment between form and climate, setting the stage for future diversification in a world still shaped by rain, warmth, and the slow easing of chaos. Gradually, without a clear boundary to mark the change, the planet's restless systems began to ease. Deep within the crust, the long episodes of widespread lava release diminished in frequency. Magma still moved and heat still rose, yet the broad pathways that once allowed constant outpouring began to narrow. The surface cooled more completely between events, and stone that had remained warm for generations finally hardened and rested. As volcanic activity slowed, the steady release of carbon into the atmosphere weakened. The flow did not stop all at once. It tapered, each century adding slightly less than the last. The difference was subtle enough to escape notice in any single moment, but over long spans it mattered. With less new gas rising from below, the balance between release and removal began to tilt back toward restraint. The planet's natural sinks continued their patient work. Rain, still frequent but no longer intensifying, interacted more effectively with exposed rock. Chemical weathering resumed its quiet role, binding carbon into minerals that washed toward the sea and settled into sediments. Soils that had begun to recover supported plant growth capable of drawing carbon from the air and storing it in roots, wood, and accumulating organic layers. Oceans played a central role in this shift. As atmospheric carbon declined, surface waters gradually cooled. Cooler water absorbed gases more readily, drawing carbon downward and holding it within deeper layers that mixed more freely as temperature gradients softened. The sea regained some of its earlier capacity to buffer change, exchanging heat and chemistry with the air in a slower, steadier rhythm. Cloud systems responded as well. With less trapped heat near the surface, evaporation eased. Moisture still rose, but not with the same urgency. Storms became less persistent, forming and dissolving with greater separation between events. Rainfall, though still present, allowed longer intervals for land to drain and recover. The atmosphere loosened its grip on warmth, releasing energy outward more effectively during clear periods. These changes unfolded together, reinforcing one another gently. Reduced carbon led to cooler conditions, which improved absorption, which further reduced carbon. The loop that had once amplified heat now worked in reverse, dampening extremes through the same interconnected pathways. The planet did not return to its earlier state. Instead, it approached a new equilibrium shaped by the long passage through instability. Life responded cautiously. Forests continued to spread where ground allowed, deepening soils and enhancing carbon storage. Wetlands stabilized, no longer expanding as rapidly, becoming reliable features rather than constantly shifting margins. Animals adjusted their movements to a landscape that changed more slowly. though flexibility remained valuable. The living world sensed the easing through opportunity rather than relief. What mattered most was not the absolute temperature reached, but the return of predictability. Seasonal patterns became clearer. Recovery intervals lengthened just enough for ecosystems to establish continuity across generations. Evolution resumed its slower pace, favoring refinement over rapid experimentation. Stability returned as a texture of time rather than a specific condition. Volcanic breath, once heavy and unbroken, became intermittent again. Carbon, once flooding the sky, found pathways back into stone, water, and life. The climate did not reset sharply. It settled, like sediment sinking through still water, layer by layer. Earth regained its capacity to correct gently rather than react continuously. This slow stabilization did not erase the legacy of what had come before. Landscapes remained reshaped, and new lineages carried adaptations forged under heat and rain. Yet the planet's systems found balance once more, not by forgetting disruption, but by absorbing its lessons into a steadier rhythm. The storms softened, the air thinned, and the long arc of equilibrium bent quietly back toward patience. Rain did not disappear all at once. It loosened its grip gradually, returning control to slower rhythms that had been waiting beneath the surface. As atmospheric carbon continued to decline, less heat remained trapped near the ground. Without that retained warmth, evaporation eased. Oceans still breathed moisture into the air, but the exchange no longer felt urgent. Water rose, gathered, and fell with increasing space between cycles. Storm systems reflected this change first in their timing. Where clouds had once regenerated almost immediately after release, now they formed with hesitation. Air currents weakened slightly, losing the constant energy supply that had sustained long-lived storms. Clouds thinned and broke apart more readily, allowing sunlight to return for longer stretches. Nights cooled more fully, interrupting the loops that had once reinforced endless rainfall. Rainfall shifted from persistence to pattern. Storms still arrived, sometimes heavy, but they no longer overlapped endlessly. Land gained time to drain. Rivers retreated toward their channels instead of spreading continuously across floodplains. Wetlands stabilized into defined boundaries rather than expanding outward with each season. The surface began to experience intervals of drying that allowed soil and roots to reconnect. As rain weakened, the atmosphere rediscovered its ability to release heat. Clearer skies during parts of the year allowed warmth to escape upward instead of cycling back downward. This cooling further reduced evaporation, reinforcing the trend. The planet's systems, once locked into amplification, now supported moderation through the same interconnected paths. Earth regained balance not by returning to the past, but by settling into a new arrangement shaped by what had come before. Forests adapted to this quieter rhythm, grew more steadily. Soils thickened as erosion slowed, and organic layers accumulated without being stripped away. Rivers carved more stable courses, and sediment movement found equilibrium between deposition and removal. Life responded cautiously, adjusting to a world that no longer demanded constant retreat or rapid response. Reproductive cycles aligned with clearer seasons. Migration paths stabilized. Energy once spent enduring persistent storms could now support growth, exploration, and refinement. Ecosystems gained complexity again, weaving interactions across longer spans of time. The key lay in pacing rather than intensity. Rain still nourished the land, but it no longer dominated it. Heat still arrived from the sun, but it no longer lingered excessively. Carbon continued to move through air, water, stone, and life, yet its circulation slowed enough for each system to keep pace. Balance returned, not as stillness, but as coordination. This recovery took place without ceremony. No single year marked the end of the storms. Instead, generations passed beneath, gradually clearing skies, noticing only that floods receded sooner, that forests recovered more reliably, that dryness returned gently rather than violently. The planet corrected itself through patience, guided by feedbacks that had endured throughout its history. The weakening of rain marked the quiet success of Earth's long regulatory systems. Volcanoes exhaled less, oceans absorbed more, vegetation stabilized land and climate together. Each component resumed its role without dominance, restoring the cooperative balance that allowed life to thrive across deep time. In this calmer atmosphere, the scars of the long wet age remained visible, etched into rock layers, altered ecosystems, and the trajectories of living lineages. Yet the storms no longer defined the world. Rain reclaimed its place as a renewing force rather than an unbroken presence. Earth regained balance not through force or intervention, but through the steady alignment of its many moving parts, returning the planet to a rhythm where change unfolded slowly enough for life to follow. The planet did not rewind when balance returned. As storms eased and climates steadied, the land carried forward, the changes carved into it over countless seasons of rain and warmth. Rivers flowed in new paths, soils layered themselves differently, and coastlines shifted where sediment had been endlessly rearranged. These physical traces guided what could grow, move, and endure. Recovery unfolded upon a foundation that no longer matched the one that had existed before. Ecosystems rebuilt themselves within these altered boundaries. New forests expanded, wetlands stabilized, and open ground found rhythm again. Yet the composition of life had changed. Many species that once shaped the Triassic world were no longer present to reclaim their roles. Their absence left space, but not a blank slate. Interactions reformed around those who remained and those who arrived later, producing communities with different balances, behaviors, and vulnerabilities. Plants returned with altered strategies. Growth favored resilience over efficiency, flexibility over specialization. Root systems adapted to soils formed under prolonged saturation. Leaves reflected lessons learned beneath persistent humidity and shifting light. These forests did not mirror their predecessors. They functioned differently, cycling nutrients and moisture in ways shaped by their recent past rather than deep memory. Animals followed similar paths. Movement patterns reflected landscapes still adjusting. Smaller forms dominated where giants once moved deliberately. Diets broadened. Activity periods shifted with new temperature and rainfall rhythms. The web of interactions regained complexity, but it was a different complexity, woven from shorter threads and faster responses. Stability returned as an emergent quality rather than a restoration of former order. The climate itself carried echoes of its disruption. Though calmer, it did not fully return to earlier states. Atmospheric circulation patterns adjusted to new continental arrangements and ocean gateways opened by tectonic change. Rainfall, while gentler, followed routes shaped by long altered terrain. Temperature gradients reflected accumulated shifts in vegetation and surface reflectivity. The world had learned a new balance and did not forget it. Extinction left its signature quietly. Gaps in the fossil record marked lineages that never resumed. Niches once occupied with precision remained altered or repurposed. Evolution did not seek to replace what was lost. It expanded into what was available, shaping life toward futures that no longer required the old arrangements. Time layered novelty upon absence, making return increasingly unlikely with each passing era. The Triassic world that had existed before the long rains belonged to a different equilibrium. It depended on patterns of dryness and recovery, on food webs built under steadier pacing. Once those patterns broke, the conditions that supported them dissolved as well. Even when climate steadied, the pathways back were gone, overwritten by new structures and relationships. Earth accepted this permanence without pause. Its systems continued their work, moving energy, water, and matter through the frameworks now in place. Life persisted not by longing for what had been, but by responding to what remained. Each generation inherited a world already shaped, adapting to it rather than attempting to restore earlier chapters. A changed world remained, not as a scar, but as a continuation. The old Triassic did not end in a single moment, nor did it vanish entirely. Its influence lingered in stone layers, altered lineages, and the trajectories of ecosystems that followed, yet it belonged to the past, unreachable by recovery alone. What followed carried its lessons forward, building upon them quietly, shaping a planet that moved onward rather than back, carrying memory without repetition. The world that followed no longer belonged to fragile balance or delicate timing. It favored endurance within motion, a landscape shaped by warmth, moisture, and recovery that unfolded gradually, rather than abruptly. In this setting, dinosaurs did not seize power through sudden conquest. They aligned with conditions already present, stepping naturally into roles that matched their abilities and pace. The new environment rewarded traits dinosaurs already carried. Upright posture lifted their bodies above damp ground, reducing energy lost to heat and moisture. Strong but efficient lungs supported sustained movement in warm, humid air. Their gait allowed long-distance travel without exhaustion, well suited to continents, stitched together by expanding forests, wetlands, and open corridors. The land no longer demanded constant retreat, but it still required flexibility, and dinosaurs possessed it in abundance. As ecosystems stabilized, food webs lengthened again. Herbivorous dinosaurs found success among regenerating plant communities that offered steady, though different, nourishment. Their teeth and digestive systems handled tougher vegetation shaped by recent disturbance. Carnivorous forms followed these herbivores, refining hunting strategies suited to open terrain, forest margins, and river edges. The relationship between predator and prey regained depth, though shaped by speed and awareness rather than ambush alone. Dinosaurs also benefited from time. With fewer dominant competitors remaining, they diversified without immediate suppression. Populations expanded gradually, adapting to local conditions while remaining connected across wide ranges. The absence of extreme barriers allowed movement between regions, spreading successful forms and behaviors across large areas. Evolution worked through continuity, favoring lineages capable of maintaining presence across generations. Continental arrangement played a quiet role in this expansion. Landmasses remained linked in broad configurations that allowed migration without long ocean crossings. River systems and coastal plains formed natural pathways, guiding movement across latitudes and climates that differed in detail but shared warmth and seasonal rhythm. Dinosaurs followed these routes, not as conquerors, but as participants moving with ecological opportunity. Reproduction supported this spread. Dinosaurs produced enough offspring to recover from local losses without overwhelming the landscape. Nesting behaviors adapted to varied environments, from open ground to sheltered vegetation. Growth rates balanced speed with durability, allowing juveniles to mature efficiently without excessive vulnerability. Each generation reinforced presence rather than replacing it abruptly. As they dispersed, Dinosaurs integrated into ecosystems rather than destabilizing them. Their size range allowed occupation of multiple levels within food webs. Smaller forms filled gaps near the ground and water, while larger bodies reshaped vegetation structure through feeding and movement. Their influence became structural, shaping how energy moved through landscapes without exhausting it. The climate supported this ascent through consistency. Warmth persisted without excess. Rain nourished rather than erased. Seasonal signals returned clearly enough to guide behavior without imposing strain. Dinosaurs did not require perfect conditions, only ones that did not change faster than adaptation could follow. This world met that requirement quietly. Over time, their presence became familiar, woven into the fabric of daily motion across the planet. Footprints crossed floodplains, forests opened where large bodies passed, and migration patterns etched invisible lines across continents. Dinosaurs stepped into power not as a sudden ruling class, but as a lasting presence shaped by compatibility with the land itself. Their spread marked the beginning of a long chapter, written slowly across continents that finally offered room, rhythm, and time enough for dominance to grow naturally. The long disruption that reshaped air, land, and life did not end with collapse alone. It rearranged the rules by which success was measured. When older systems unraveled, they did more than remove species and habitats. They dismantled hierarchies that had endured for millions of years, clearing paths that had never existed before. Destruction did not crown a victor immediately, but it loosened the ground beneath every established power. As environments broke apart and reassembled, dominance shifted away from size alone and toward compatibility with change. The disaster thinned forests, simplified food webs, and shortened chains of dependence. In doing so, it stripped advantage from creatures bound to narrow roles. What remained was a landscape that rewarded persistence, mobility, and adaptability across broad conditions. This new balance favored those already shaped for motion rather than specialization. The climate crisis acted as a long filter rather than a single blow. Each phase removed forms unable to keep pace with instability. What passed through this filter did so repeatedly, generation after generation, inheriting traits refined by survival rather than abundance. By the time conditions steadied, the survivors were not merely present. They were refined, tested, and widely distributed across reshaped continents. In this cleared ecological space, dinosaurs did not face entrenched resistance. Former competitors had faded. Predators that once controlled territory were gone or diminished. The remaining fauna occupied niches that no longer pressed upward with the same intensity. Energy flowed differently, lingering longer within middle levels of food webs where new lineages could expand without immediate suppression. Dominance grew quietly from this freedom. Dinosaurs diversified into roles that had once been divided among many groups. Some grazed on recovering vegetation, others hunted across open ground, while smaller forms filled the spaces in between. Their variety allowed them to connect ecosystems rather than fragment them. Each successful lineage reinforced the others by stabilizing food webs around shared presence. Geography amplified this process. Continents still lay close enough to permit movement without isolation. Climatic belts, though altered, stretched widely, allowing species to follow familiar warmth across long distances. Rivers and plains served as corridors rather than barriers. Dinosaurs spread steadily, carrying successful traits across vast areas and establishing continuity between regions shaped by the same recent history. The empire that emerged was not one of uniform control, but of ecological integration. Dinosaurs became central because many systems now depended on them. Their feeding patterns influenced plant growth. Their movement shaped landscapes. Their presence anchored food webs that rebuilt around their roles. Dominance, in this sense, meant becoming indispensable rather than unrivaled. Crucially, this ascent did not demand constant innovation. Once established, dinosaurs benefited from the relative calm that followed the stormy age. Stability allowed incremental improvement rather than desperate experimentation. Lineages refined size, behavior, and specialization while maintaining the flexibility that had allowed survival. The empire matured slowly, carried forward by continuity rather than conquest. The disaster that preceded this rise remained written into every layer of success. Without prolonged rain, collapsing forests, and broken food chains, the door would not have opened so widely. The empire was born from absence, shaped by endurance, and sustained by a world taught to value adaptability above all else. In this way, climate catastrophe did not simply reset life, it redirected it. The empire that followed was not planned, claimed, or seized. It emerged as a consequence of survival across upheaval, where those best suited to live within change found themselves, at last, in a world that moved at their pace. Earth does not forget the events that bend its systems far enough to alter their paths. Long after rain eased and carbon declined, the planet continued to carry the imprint of that prolonged disruption, not as a scar frozen in time, but as a subtle adjustment in how its atmosphere, oceans, and living surface responded to change. The memory remained embedded in process rather than appearance. Later climates were shaped by this inheritance. Circulation patterns in air and sea evolved within boundaries set by reshaped continents, altered coastlines, and reorganized ecosystems. Forests that returned influenced rainfall differently than those that came before, changing how moisture moved between land and sky. Soils formed under extended saturation affected how heat was absorbed and released. Each of these elements guided future climates toward pathways already tested by stress. Carbon cycling carried one of the clearest echoes. The event refined how carbon moved through rock, water, and life, strengthening some pathways while weakening others. Sediments laid down during that age locked away vast amounts of carbon, subtly altering baseline levels for millions of years to come. Weathering processes, once accelerated, continued with greater efficiency where landscapes remained exposed. Later periods of warming and cooling unfolded atop this adjusted balance. Oceans remembered as well. Their circulation patterns adjusted to new temperature gradients and chemical conditions. Layers mixed differently, storing heat and carbon in ways shaped by long experience with excess. When later volcanic pulses or tectonic shifts added new gases to the air, the oceans responded not as blank slates, but as systems already tuned by earlier extremes. Life amplified this memory through evolution. Lineages shaped during the wet, overheated world carried forward traits that influenced how ecosystems responded to later change. Plants adapted for moisture and warmth, altered surface reflectivity and transpiration long after conditions stabilized. Animals refined for flexibility spread across regions, shaping food webs resilient to fluctuation. Each generation preserved lessons learned without awareness, encoded in form and behavior. Because these adjustments persisted, similar patterns could repeat. When carbon levels rose again in later ages, some of the same feedbacks emerged. Warmer oceans increased evaporation. Clouds responded to added heat. Rainfall intensified in familiar ways. The repetition was not exact, but the rhythm echoed. Earth followed grooves carved by past experience, returning to behaviors that had once dominated when thresholds were crossed. This repetition did not signal fragility alone, it reflected consistency. The same physical laws governed each episode, interacting with landscapes and biospheres shaped by prior events. The planet responded according to structures already in place. Memory, in this sense, meant predictability within complexity, not inevitability, but tendency. Importantly, Earth also remembered recovery. The mechanisms that restored balance once remained available again. Weathering, biological uptake, ocean absorption, and tectonic pacing continued their quiet work. Each later disruption carried within it the potential for correction, though unfolding over long spans that dwarfed any single species' perspective. The deep past thus remained present, not as a story retold, but as guidance built into the system itself. The planet carried forward an understanding of what sustained imbalance could do and how balance could be found again without intervention. Change followed patterns because the pathways existed, tested and reinforced by time. Earth still carries this memory because it never resets completely. Every climate is shaped by what came before, every equilibrium informed by earlier extremes. The long rains did not vanish into history. They became part of the planet's working knowledge, shaping how future worlds would warm, cool, destabilize, and heal, again and again, with quiet familiarity. The long story of that ancient climate teaches quietly through its pacing rather than its drama. Earth did not shift overnight, yet once certain thresholds were crossed, change accelerated faster than the living world could easily follow. Processes that usually balanced one another began to amplify instead, turning slow trends into persistent motion. What stands out is not sudden catastrophe, but how quickly systems already under strain can slide into new behavior when pushed just far enough. Climate is built from relationships. Heat, water, rock, air, and life are woven together through exchanges that normally soften extremes. When one element moves beyond its usual range, the others respond. Sometimes they counter it, sometimes they follow. The ancient rains show how easily feedbacks can reverse their role, becoming drivers rather than dampeners. Once that shift occurs, the planet does not need continuous force to keep changing. It moves on its own momentum. Speed emerges from connection. Warming oceans increase evaporation. Moist air traps more heat. Rain alters land surfaces, which then change how energy is absorbed and released. None of these steps is extraordinary alone. Together, they form pathways that allow small changes to cascade. The lesson is not that climate is fragile in isolation, but that it is powerful in motion once balance loosens. This deep past also shows that instability carries a cost beyond temperature alone. Life endured heat, humidity, and altered chemistry, yet struggled most where patterns stopped repeating. When seasons blurred and recovery intervals shortened, ecosystems lost their footing. Stability mattered because it allowed planning across generations. Roots could grow where soil remained. Migration could follow predictable signals. Reproduction could align with reliable conditions. When those signals faded, survival demanded constant adjustment. Stability does not mean stillness. The ancient world was always changing. Continents moved, volcanoes breathed. Life evolved continuously. What mattered was the rhythm. Change unfolded slowly enough for systems to absorb it. Once that rhythm broke, complexity thinned, not from violence, but from exhaustion. Energy spent coping could not also support growth and diversity. The recovery that followed reinforces this lesson. Balance returned when feedback softened again, when heat escaped more easily, when rain allowed pauses, and when carbon moved at a pace other systems could match. Life flourished once patterns reappeared, even though the world remained altered. Stability provided space for complexity to reemerge, not by reversing change, but by slowing it into something livable. This ancient chapter suggests that climate change is not defined only by endpoints. It is shaped by trajectories. Where a system is headed, how fast it moves, and whether it can pause along the way all matter. Earth has endured warmer and cooler states many times. The greatest disruptions arose when movement outpaced adjustment. The past does not warn through alarm. It explains through continuity. The same physics still operate. The same connections still exist. Atmosphere, ocean, land, and life continue to respond together. When balance holds, change unfolds gently. When it slips, momentum builds. What this story offers is perspective. Climate is neither fixed nor random, it is responsive. Stability matters because it keeps responsiveness cooperative rather than runaway. The ancient rains remind us that Earth changes most dramatically when balance gives way, and that recovery, while possible, follows its own slow and patient timelines. Life has always existed within boundaries it cannot see, not walls or edges, but balances moving quietly through the air above every landscape. These balances are invisible, yet they shape temperature, rainfall, chemistry, and time itself. When they hold steady, life flourishes with little awareness of their presence. When they shift, even slightly, the living world responds immediately. The atmosphere is not merely a blanket of gases. It is an active system that distributes heat, moisture, and energy across the planet. Oxygen supports metabolism. Carbon dioxide regulates warmth. Water vapor moves energy between ocean and land. Each component plays a role, not through abundance alone, but through proportion. Life evolved not just to exist within air, but within a very narrow range of atmospheric relationships. These balances are fragile because they rely on constant cooperation between Earth's systems. Oceans absorb heat and gases, moderating extremes. Forests release moisture and stabilize temperature through transpiration. Soils store carbon and nutrients, anchoring ecosystems to the surface. When these systems interact smoothly, the atmosphere remains within ranges life can tolerate. The danger arises when one pathway overwhelms the others. Excess heat alters evaporation. Altered evaporation reshapes clouds. Clouds influence temperature again, reinforcing changes instead of softening them. None of this requires violence. It unfolds through arithmetic rather than force, through accumulation rather than shock. Life often perceives the change only after the balance has already shifted. Because these processes are invisible, they are easily underestimated. Air looks the same, whether stable or drifting toward imbalance. Rain can fall gently, even as chemistry changes. Warmth can feel familiar while accumulating faster than ecosystems can adjust. Life responds to outcomes, not mechanisms, and by the time consequences appear, momentum may already exist. The living planet depends on narrow margins. Small temperature differences separate ice from liquid water. Slight chemical shifts alter soil fertility and ocean acidity. Minor changes in circulation redirect storms and droughts. Life adapts constantly, yet only within limits set by these invisible frameworks. Beyond those limits, adaptation slows, fragments, or fails. What makes this fragility remarkable is not weakness, but precision. Earth systems have maintained habitable conditions for immense spans of time through feedbacks that usually work quietly and reliably. The same fragility that allows disruption also allows remarkable stability when balances remain intact. Life thrives not despite delicacy, but because of finely tuned interaction. The ancient climate disruptions demonstrate this clearly. Life did not vanish when heat rose or rain intensified. It struggled when relationships between systems broke down. Stability mattered more than comfort. Predictable patterns allowed roots to grow deep, migrations to align, and reproduction to succeed. When patterns dissolved, effort shifted from thriving to enduring. Atmospheric balance acts like a shared language spoken by air, water, rock, and life. When the language remains consistent, cooperation follows. When it shifts too quickly, confusion spreads across ecosystems. Recovery is possible, but it unfolds on timescales far longer than individual lives or lineages can control. A living planet is therefore not guaranteed by presence of water or sunlight alone. It depends on ongoing equilibrium among invisible forces. These forces do not announce themselves, yet they decide which worlds remain vibrant and which become quiet. Earth's history shows that fragility is not failure. It is a reminder that life exists within precise conditions maintained by constant motion and restraint. The atmosphere holds the planet together gently, invisibly, and continuously. When its balances remain aligned, life persists with abundance. When they drift, the living world feels the shift long before it can name it, carried by air that looks unchanged, yet behaves differently. Earth has never relied on speed to heal. Its strength lies in duration, in processes that continue quietly long after attention shifts elsewhere. When imbalance stretches systems toward their limits, the planet does not react with urgency. It responds with patience, allowing countless small adjustments to accumulate until direction changes. Recovery unfolds not as reversal, but as redirection. As excess carbon lingered in the air, Earth's correcting mechanisms never stopped working. They simply worked more slowly than the disturbance that overwhelmed them. Rain continued to interact with rock, breaking down minerals and carrying carbon into rivers and seas. Plants, wherever they could take hold, continued drawing gases from the air and storing them in living tissue and soil. Oceans absorbed heat and chemistry layer by layer, redistributing energy away from the surface. These processes acted together, not through coordination, but through inevitability. Water will always flow downhill. Heat will always seek cooler space. Chemistry will always favor stability over excess. Earth's systems are built upon these tendencies, and given enough time, they guide the planet back toward balance without conscious direction. Tectonic motion played its role as well. The same forces that once allowed vast outpourings of lava continued to move continents slowly, altering ocean circulation and atmospheric pathways. Mountain ranges rose, redirecting winds and rainfall. New seafloors formed, renewing chemical exchange between crust and ocean. Over immense spans, these shifts reshaped how energy and gases moved across the planet. Life amplified recovery rather than resisting it. As ecosystems stabilized, biological cycles strengthened. Forests deepened soils, anchoring carbon and moderating temperature. Wetlands filtered water and stored nutrients. Marine life incorporated carbon into shells and skeletons that settled into sediment. Each organism acted locally, yet together they formed a global network of regulation. What makes Earth self-correcting is not perfection, but redundancy. Many systems perform similar functions through different pathways. If one weakens, others continue. No single process carries the burden alone. This layering allows recovery even after prolonged disruption, though never instantly and never exactly back to where conditions began. Equilibrium, however, is not a fixed destination. Earth does not aim for one ideal state. It finds balance relative to its current configuration of continents, oceans, atmosphere, and life. Each recovery settles into a new arrangement shaped by what remains. The planet always moves forward, carrying memory within structure rather than attempting restoration. This tendency explains why equilibrium eventually returns even after extreme change. Feedbacks that increase imbalance often exhaust themselves. Excess heat accelerates processes that release it. Excess carbon enhances pathways that remove it. Over long timescales, stabilizing forces regain influence because they are fundamental expressions of physics and chemistry rather than temporary conditions. The return of balance does not erase consequence. Ecosystems transform, lineages rise and fall, landscapes change permanently. Yet within those new boundaries, Earth finds steadiness again. The system does not fail because it bends because bending allows continuity. Earth's history shows countless examples of this pattern: periods of chaos followed by calm, accumulation followed by release, instability followed by adjustment. Each cycle differs in detail, but the outcome remains consistent. The planet persists by redistributing energy and matter until extremes soften. In this way, Earth behaves less like a machine and more like a current. Disturbances create turbulence, but flow continues. Obstacles reshape direction, yet motion remains. Given time, the current smooths again. Earth is self-correcting not because it avoids crisis, but because it absorbs it. Recovery does not arrive with certainty of outcome, only with certainty of movement toward balance. Equilibrium returns, not as repetition, but as continuation, carrying forward a world reshaped, yet once again capable of sustaining life. The long storm faded, but its influence never left. Even after balance returned and skies settled into gentler rhythms, the planet carried forward the outcomes of that distant upheaval. Landscapes rebuilt themselves on altered ground. Life diversified from lineages that had passed through pressure and uncertainty. The echo of that climate nightmare moved quietly through time, shaping what could exist next. Every modern ecosystem traces its structure to survivors of that era. Forests that grew later inherited traits refined under heat and persistent rain. Leaves managed water differently. Roots interacted with soils shaped by saturation and erosion. Growth patterns reflected lessons written when stability could not be taken for granted. Even in calm ages, those inherited strategies continued to guide how plants interacted with air, light, and moisture. Animals carried the echo as well. Forms that endured had bodies tuned for flexibility rather than narrow advantage. Metabolism favored balance. Movement favored efficiency. Reproduction favored resilience across changing conditions. These qualities became foundations for later success, spreading through lineages long after the original pressures disappeared. What survived the storm did not forget it. It carried its influence forward silently. The structure of food webs reflects this legacy. Modern ecosystems rely on redundancy and overlap, not brittle specialization alone. Multiple species perform similar roles, buffering systems against disruption. This pattern did not arise by chance. It emerged from ages when single points of failure proved costly. The storm taught life that persistence depends on shared function rather than perfect optimization. Climate systems retained memory as well. Patterns of rainfall, circulation, and energy exchange developed within pathways carved by ancient imbalance. The planet learned how to move heat, carbon, and water through networks strengthened by stress. Later climates followed these channels, responding to change with behaviors shaped by deep experience rather than novelty. Even extinctions that followed carried the storm's imprint. When later disruptions arrived, life responded through frameworks forged earlier. Some lineages vanished, others adapted quickly. Recovery unfolded along familiar trajectories, guided by mechanisms refined in the distant past. The storm became a reference point written into the system itself. What makes this legacy remarkable is its subtlety. No monument marks the storm's passing, no boundary declares where its influence ends. Yet every living system, from rainforest to reef, exists because certain forms endured while others did not. Each modern habitat represents a continuation of that filtering, selecting for traits that allowed survival when the world moved faster than comfort allowed. The storm shaped dominance without intention. It did not choose winners. It removed constraints, cleared space, and altered balance until new orders emerged naturally. Life reorganized around endurance, compatibility, and patience. These qualities became advantages not only during crisis, but afterward, guiding expansion across calmer worlds. In this way, catastrophe became foundation, not through destruction alone, but through what persisted beyond it. The storm did not define life by what it lost, but by what it carried forward. Every later chapter built upon that inheritance, adding complexity atop resilience. The echo remains because Earth builds upon its past, rather than erasing it. Each recovery retains structure. Each calm period rests on layers shaped by earlier extremes. The storm still echoes not as threat, but as architecture. Every modern ecosystem exists because something lived through that long reign, through heat, instability, and uncertainty. Survival became direction, direction became diversity, and diversity became the world we recognize today, a planet shaped not only by gentle ages, but by the quiet endurance of life that weathered a storm deep enough to change everything that followed.